All right. So yes, welcome to lecture 3, where we're going to talk about formal philosophy and cost counting. More specifically, the aims for today, I want to start off by kind of reviewing where we're at in the broad arc of the lectures we've looked at. And then I want to segue from some of the failures or problems that we saw with logical positivism and the ordinary language philosophy approaches last week to turn to what I'm going to call deduction or deductive methods or formal methods. So I have a very particular and specific kind of thing in mind here. And I want to talk to you about how this particular deductive method works, what its aims are, give you some very quick and dirty examples of what it looks like, talk about what's good and what's bad. You probably have already gotten the gist of this. And then I want to pivot to talk about this sort of counting costs, or it's often called theory choice methodology. And this is if there really is a kind of received methodology in analytic philosophy, it's something like this. It's still going pretty strong. Even the people who don't like it still use something very much like it. So I want to kind of give you a grip on what it looks like, what the ideas are, and then talk about some problems. What are the limitations of this kind of method? And finally finish off by talking about where to go from here, because the next block of 3 lectures are going to be a kind of tonal shift. So that's the plan. You guys know the drill. So questions along the way, anything like that, please feel free. So the first thing I want to talk about is where are we? What have we done? God, what have we done? Also, if you've never seen this movie, it's worth tracking it down. Buckaroo Banzai is amazing. So we started off in lecture 1 by kind of motivating the whole process, motivating the idea that we need to think about the methodology of philosophy, like how we do it. And this is particularly because it seems really important to answer these questions or to have a grip on how to do philosophy, because knowing how to do it means, or at least suggests ways to do it well or to not do it well. It's avoiding turning all of philosophy into just opinion mongering, because that doesn't seem very satisfying in a way. Now pin that. We're going to come back to that point later. So that kind of pushed us into thinking, all right, we should think about method. And then I made a distinction between what I called higher and lower order questions of method. And this was very fuzzy. But the broad idea of the lower ones was something like, what are some specific tools that we might use to answer philosophical questions? So one of the things we're going to talk about next week is exactly this, right? We'll talk about computational tools that help you answer some questions in thinking about history of philosophy. But that's not really what a lot of methodological questions are about. They're not answered by saying, oh, you use this tool, or you use thought experiments, or something like this. It's more sort of, how do you even get to terms with what kind of counts as a good philosophy question? Or how would you go about understanding what tools are appropriate or inappropriate? Again, I flailed a little bit at this distinction, but I hope the broad brushstrokes difference here is kind of clear. And we've basically been talking about that higher order stuff for the last couple of weeks. That's what we talked about last week. That's what we're going to talk about today. So, and then in lecture 2, we started off with this idea of kind of being worried about a lack of philosophical progress. So there's a lot of philosophical problems that we haven't answered. And we haven't even really kind of made any move towards answering. The debate about, for example, the existence of properties and whether properties are universals has basically been the same since when Plato and Aristotle were still kicking around. We're doing it in English and Dutch and German now instead of Greek, but it's the same questions. And the same broad family of answers are still out there. And you might think that this is bad, that there's lots of areas in philosophy that are akin to that. And this lack of philosophical progress might set off some alarm bells. In particular, it might lead you to think that many philosophical debates, especially metaphysical ones, are epistemically defective. That is, the reason there's no philosophical progress is that there's no way to know when a philosophical claim is true or false. There's no way to know when a position is true or false, nor to know when a debate's settled, because in order to know that it's settled, you'd have to know that one of the answers is definitely true or definitely false. And then the views we looked at last week gave us an explanation for why there was this epistemic problem. And it's because the philosophical claims are semantically defective, right? They're grammatical, they seem like they're saying something, but they don't actually even express anything. You might as well be whistling. So the positivists gave a certain spin on how that went. The ordinary language philosophers gave us a different spin on this, but they both broadly came to the same idea. So far, so good, right? That's what we talked about last time. So they're semantically defective, the claims are grammatical, but they don't say anything. We had two ways of cashing that out. The positivists told us, hey, claims are meaningful if and only if they're either analytic or they're verifiable in principle. The ordinary language philosophers said, hey, philosophical claims seem like they're saying something because they abuse everyday terminology, but they're stretching it out in a way that it just distorts it so bad it doesn't actually have the meaning that it's supposed to anymore. Both of these options had some positive qualities, but they also had lots of bad. Again, just the reason. What I want to do for today is start off by going back to the worry that got us into lecture 2. So this idea about progress or lack of progress, and that there's kind of corresponding epistemic issues with a bunch of philosophical claims. And maybe goes the thought to start today, the reason the stuff in lecture 2 wasn't good was because it dealt with those epistemic and progress worries in the wrong way. Instead of dismissing the questions, let's take them seriously. Let's take them as meaningful. And let's see if we can find ways to answer them. Let's try and take them head on, answer the questions, and maybe make some progress. And both the kind of methods I want to talk about today are going to try and do that. In kind of different ways. So the way we're going to start off with first is to use some tools that are, by their nature, epistemically impeccable. What I mean by that is they kind of guarantee epistemic certainty. If you know that the things that you're putting into these tools, or what you started with is true, then what you're going to get coming out is going to be true too. Yeah.
You mean impeccable as in a priori analytical?
So impeccable literally just means there's no problems with it. There's no blemishes on it.
That should mean that it's true no matter how you see it.
So importantly, in this case, when we're thinking about epistemically impeccable, what I just mean is that, right, if we're confident in whatever we started with, we're going to be just as confident in the thing we get out.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That's all.
Yeah.
Not like, oh, fuck, it's ironclad, it's a priori, we absolutely know it. Mm-hmm. Just this claim here.
So even though the result is false, you still have the same attitude with it, and you try to save it or go on?
Well, importantly, this is sort of, I'm dancing around a little bit. Importantly, if what we started with is true, and we use the tool we're going to talk about, then the thing that we're going to get cannot be false.
Has to be true.
Has to be true. Doesn't mean a guarantee that it is, because it could turn out the stuff we started with was wrong too. Mm-hmm. But it's, if the stuff we started with is good, this thing is too.
Yeah, but I see.
But that's an if. It's an if claim, right? So, what's the tool we're going to use? Well, the clue's kind of in the title. It's already spoiled. Going to be deductive logic. We're going to use some formal methods. Something very close to what we talked about last year in the logic class, but not the same. Okay. So, again, the idea here isn't just, hey, we can use logic. Of course we can. That's back to that lower level kind of methodological thing. The idea here is let's use formal methods in this higher order way. Maybe the only way we should be doing philosophy is by purely through formal methods. Now, this isn't like, hey, truth tables are the greatest thing ever, which is kind of true. They're pretty fucking cool, right? But it's that the move to formal logic is the best way to do philosophy. This is how to do philosophy well. And why is it how to do philosophy well? Because it gives you this. Any epistemic worries you might have about your claims go away. Because you know, if the stuff we started with is good, then these philosophical conclusions I have derived are also good. Now, of course, you can already start to hear something worrisome there. It was already in the conversation we had. The claim I just gave you was an if claim. If what we started with is good, then what we're going to get out is good. Come back to that. But this at least offers us a way to make progress, and it offers us a way to avoid this epistemically defective worry. It can't be defective unless what we started with was defective too. So, the place to start, this is hopefully a familiar slide. The place to start is to pull apart different argument types. We talked about this last year, so I won't spend too long. There's deductive arguments, where we have some premises, and they're supposed to get us to the conclusion. The truth of the premises is meant to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. In contrast, we have inductive arguments. And this is the kind of thing where, right, we build up a bunch of evidence, and then we make a prediction or a projection about future cases. We've dropped the pen a bunch of times, so then we say, the next time I drop the pen, it's going to fall to the ground. Or every time someone drops a pen, it will fall to the ground. We're building further upon empirical observations. Or we have an abductive argument, right? This inference to the best explanation. We have some data, and the conclusion of the argument is meant to be the best possible explanation that we can come up with that explains why all the data is true together. Don't worry too much about these argument forms. Just want to kind of remind you about them. Now, one really important thing is that deductive arguments, they're kind of peak. What they're aiming for is validity. Valid deductive arguments express what we'll call an unbreakable connection between the premise's truth and the conclusion's truth. If the argument's valid, then the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. That's just what it is to be valid. In contrast, strong or good inductive and abductive arguments don't have that much of a guarantee. They might build up your credence, your degree of belief in the conclusion, but they're never going to guarantee it. It's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. This isn't to say they're bad. It's just that they're not as epistemically secure. Valid deductive arguments give us the absolute pinnacle of epistemic security. They are, to use the phrase I had 2 slides ago, epistemically impeccable. If you know the premises, then you know the conclusion, provided the argument's valid. That's the thought. This suggests a very clear 3-phase methodology for doing philosophy. Step 1, symbolize. Take your philosophical theories, your claims, re-express them, symbolize them in a formal language. Step 2, deduce. Right? Employ various deductive methods to figure out what follows from the things that you have symbolized. And then step 3, profit. Right? That is, Take the new, exciting philosophical results you derived in step 2 and share them. Gain philosophical knowledge. That's just what step 3 is. A very simple methodology, right? Take your philosophical claims. All of that ordinary language. Ordinary language is crap. It's wonderful and expressive. It's also muddy. It's vague. It allows for a bunch of indeterminacy that we don't want. So get rid of it. Symbolize it. Express it in our beautiful, pristine, perfect formal languages. Then use various deductive tools to see what happens, and you will have results, that are epistemically secure. In that if what you started with is good, then what you got out is just as good. That's not a low-level methodology in the sense that these deductive tools could be used to answer particular philosophical questions. But it gives you a very broad methodology. And I want to just say, before we talk any further, it's a little bit of a caricature to say that there's anybody ever who thought this was the only way to do philosophy. There are some people who, in their heights of huffing too much mathematics, thought this was the only way to do philosophy, but they very quickly run into some problems. But it's worth thinking about this as something like a caricature methodology, because it helps us see some things about what's really powerful in these formal methods, and also some problems with these formal methods. So, here's a beautiful 3-step methodology. Collect underpants, ? Profit. This deductive methodology offers a way for us to get around the epistemic worries, potentially make some progress. If the steps are in good order, then the results are guaranteed to be in good epistemic standing, or at least as good as where we started with. That's just what the good standing means, right? They're valid arguments, they're epistemically impeccable. The truth of the premises is going to guarantee truth of conclusion. And second thing, progress. Progress. It looks like new things will be generated. New results will come through. Old claims will be refuted. New positions formulated. Yes?
I can't help but think this is some sort of backtracking system, which actually is more of a confirmative system instead of figuring out new things.
It can be. So I think that we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But I think that there's really I think there's a lot of value to this kind of thing. But if there's any case where it's really useful, it's exactly in that, right? Where you take some view and you show that it leads to ruin. And that's very useful. But note that then becomes that kind of lower order tool to use, rather than this is the way, the only way, truth and light to do philosophy. But maybe that's okay. Again, I'm trying to give the hard sell here, right? For something that I don't necessarily buy into. It's okay. But everybody can sort of see the sales pitch here, yeah? Whether we buy it or not. I just want to make sure we get the sales pitch. Did I skip something? Okay. So I guess the thing to reemphasize before I get to the first question is, again, this is really nice. If everything follows through in the method, then we seem to have answers to the worries. We have a worry to the answer to the epistemic worry, and we have an answer to this, there's no progress being made worry. We can give you new stuff, and we can give you epistemically secure new stuff, which is nice. Prima facie. So our first question, I'm actually going to go back a slide to show the method again. Our first question is going to target step 1. And put really bluntly, our first question is, cool, we want to symbolize. Symbolize into what? Easy example. Last year, we learned 2 formal languages, right? Truth functional logic and first order logic. So when we say we express our claims using a formal language, which one? Which one do you want to pick? Which formal language should you use to do your symbolizing? And of course, a formal language is very helpful because it strips away irrelevant material. Which material counts as irrelevant? And this is a big challenge for this methodology. Because, of course, the choice is going to be really significant. It's going to impact what you can express, and hence what kinds of arguments or deductions you're going to find feasible. Really straightforward one. I think we even talked about something like this argument last year. Take Aristotle as a man. All men are mortal, so Aristotle is mortal. Valid? Invalid? What do we think? Valid? Invalid? Flashback to last year. Some people are having flashbacks. If the premises are true, could the conclusion be false? No, right? If Aristotle's a man and all men are mortal, then he must be mortal. He's one of these things, all of these things are those things, so he must be one of those too. Cool. Problem. If we symbolize this in truth functional logic, sentential or propositional as it's also called, this is invalid. Because that language doesn't have the kind of grammatical complexity to capture the complexity in the English sentences. In contrast, if we symbolize this in something like first order logic, we get it. Sure, cool. We can deliver it as being valid. But this already highlights a major point. Which language you pick is going to impact what kind of things you can get. Because it literally gets in the way of what you can express. But of course, FOL, for all of its potency, and it's really powerful, can't do everything. So here's an easy example. How would you formalize an FOL? Possibly, my sweater is blue. You can't get it as Nathan's sweater is blue because that's false. It's black. Well, it used to be black. It's mostly gray now. Right? The problem here is we don't have a way to capture this possibly claim. Yeah.
Couldn't you have a sign for possibly blue?
Yes. So we could start to add in either operators for possibly, or read this as like a predicate is possibly blue. So there's ways to kind of go here. But no, once we do that, what we have to do is change the language by expanding it in various ways. Either by expanding the kinds of predicates we're going to find acceptable, because there's going to be plenty of things that aren't even in the domain that would still count as possibly blue. Little blue men from Venus or whatever. They don't actually exist, but they're possibly blue. That's the kind of. So the thought here is basically that even if we take FOL as it stands, again, incredibly powerful language, captures so much of what we want to do in natural language, there's still more that we need to be able to capture. We need to change it. We need to modify it. Another easy one. If you guys remember last year, when we were thinking about TFL and FOL, I told you tense doesn't matter. Socrates is a man, Socrates was a man, Socrates will be a man. For FOL's purposes, we can treat those all as the same. In fact, we have to. Because it doesn't have a way to capture tense. Now, if you want to capture tense, we have to complicate the language. We can build it into the predicates, but that's going to run into some cases when we just want to talk about some sentence being formally true, or it was the case that it was raining. What do we attach the was raining predicate to? But the important thing here is, again, in order to capture various, in this case, English claims, you've got to complicate the language. which language we pick, which formal system we pick, impacts what we can express. Does that make sense? Do we see the thought? So there's our first challenge for this option. Cool. Symbolize into what? Pick for me. And this isn't just an easy or cheap question. This is a substantive question because it impacts what you can even do or say. That's not the big worry here. The big worry is in the second step. The second step, if you remember, was deduce. Right? And the second question is, cool, how? Which way do I do this? And this is more like, what tools do I have to do the deducing? What kinds of deducing am I allowed or permitted to do? And note, if we're dealing with TFL, cool, we can do some truth tables. But what about more expressively powerful languages? Like here's a kind of weird writer. If you remember last year we did FOL. I never taught you how to prove that an argument's valid. We only ever talked about how to prove that an FOL argument's invalid. So how do you show that an FOL argument is in fact valid? I never gave you that tool. Talk a little bit about it just now. Here's a thought. The kind of deducing that you should be doing, the tool you should be using here, is constructing proofs. So we're going to have a proof system. And a proof is a step-by-step rigorous presentation of an argument, and it explicates the reasoning employed throughout. It shows you how to go from the premises you have, step by step by step by step, to get to the conclusion and what each step was like. So that's what a proof is. A formal proof, shockingly, is going to be a proof expressed in a formal language. Proof systems are systems designed to allow us to construct formal proofs. They use specifically constructed formal languages. They have highly regimented syntax to avoid syntactic ambiguity. Basically, really restricted grammar only lets you express the kinds of things that fit in your proof system. And they let us construct these formal proofs, finite structured sequence of sentences in a formal language, some of which are marked as assumptions or axioms, the last of which is our conclusion, and they show us how to derive the conclusion from the assumptions using specified inference rules. That's big and ugly and hideous. I'm going to characterize a formal proof system a little bit easier. There's two key parts to a formal proof system. First part is the axioms. Where do you start? What do you take as given? These are going to be sentences expressed in your formal language, and they are taken to be true. They could either be taken to be true because they are in fact true, or simply assumed for the sake of this given argument. So a sentence could be an axiom for this argument, or it could be an axiom tout court, right, kind of across the board. Axioms are one thing. The other pillar is our inference rules. And these are literally rules about how you can infer. Rules about how you can go from this to that. And the process for a formal proof is we start with some axioms, and we apply inference rules to let us derive kind of dependent sentences, dependent steps, and we keep doing that until we end up at the conclusion. So what we get is something that shows an argument is valid, and it gives us insight into literally how to show that it's valid, how to go from the premises, from the axioms or assumptions, to the conclusion itself. I'm talking about this very generally. I'll give you an example of one in a couple of slides, but I want to keep talking about the rules and things first. So inference rules are really the action here. It's the kind of rules that you can make. It's the moves you can make in the board game. What can you do when it's your turn? Inference rules tell you what you can do. And they come in two broad types. Wow, I even typed board instead of broad. That's kind of funny. Right? Two broad, not board, types. There are introduction rules. Introduction rules allow you to introduce a sentence featuring some operator. So an easy introduction rule is if you already have derived the sentence A and already derived the sentence B, then you can take those two, slap them together with a conjunction, and derive A conjunction B. So the introduction rule would be the rule that tells you you can introduce the sentence featuring the conjunction. That's conjunction introduction. On the flip side, you can have elimination rules, and these are kind of badly named. They're really exploitation rules. They tell us if you have a sentence featuring some operator, this is what you can do. This is what you can get out of it. So for example, again, picking on conjunction, if you have A conjunction B, and you know that it's true, well, remember that a conjunction is only true if both conjuncts are true. So from A conjunction B, you can eliminate or extract or exploit to get A. Or you could do the same and get B. It's basically extracting the parts, seeing what follows. Again, don't worry too much about these, but introduction rules give us new complex sentences featuring an operator. Elimination rules tell us how we can use sentences featuring an operator. So using these rules, these inference rules, what we get with a formal proof system is they tell us a way how an idealized reasoner would make inferences from some assumptions, premises, to a specific result, the conclusion. And instead of just merely being able to assess whether an argument's valid or not, we now know why. We know how it is you can go from premises to conclusion. We've got the path. And in this way, what proofs give us, what formal proofs give us, is this ideal. We have epistemic certainty, and we also have epistemic clarity. We know not only that if the axioms are true, then the conclusion is, but we know how or why. We can walk you from the starting assumptions to the conclusion. And that's much more powerful than something like a truth table. Because a truth table shows us, or can show us, that an argument's valid. But this shows you why it's valid. So at their best, proof systems clarify the form and structure of argumentative reasoning. They show you how an argument goes and what steps it has. They make explicit the means used to justify a conclusion from some collection of assumptions. And to be honest, kind of the most useful thing, and this comes back to something that was said just a few minutes ago, they make obvious where people should disagree if they want to. Is this something where you need to reject one of the opening assumptions? Is that the problem? Or is there some specific step in the derivation that's a problem? Is this application of a rule problematic? Something like this. By laying everything bare, we make it very clear for our opponents what's good and what's bad, or more importantly, where the weak points are. So, here is a sample TFL natural deduction proof. I'm not going to make you learn natural deduction, but I wanted to sort of show it to you to give you an idea of what it looks like. So we have this TFL argument, right? So we've got first premise is a conjunction, second premise is a conditional, and the conclusion is a conjunction. For the proof, what we do, we start off with the premises as our axioms, as our assumptions. And we have this line right here. And it indicates everything above it we're taking as given. We're assuming to be true. Everything below follows. And we're going to show you how. And what we do is each line here is a sentence of some kind that we are going to derive from the assumptions. And when we derive it, we say, what rule did we use? And these are always going to be introduction or elimination rules. Remember, we talked about those just a second ago. Either exploiting some sentence's operator or introducing a sentence featuring an operator. So in this case, we take our first sentence, and in steps 3 and 4, what we do is we break the conjunction and get both conjuncts. Then in step 5, we take the conditional in sentence 2 and the antecedent to the conditional that we've got in step 4, and we derive the consequent. Because if the conditional is true, which is what we've assumed at line 2, and we know that the antecedent is true, then the consequent must be true too. So we can get C. And then because we've already got A in step 3, we jam them together, link them with a conjunction. Again, this is just an example. Don't stress too much about it. I'm not going to drag you back into the hell that is natural or formal logic. But you can see, if you know how to read this, if you know what the rules are for this system, this is beautiful. Like, this is so clear. You know exactly the reasoning that someone gave. You know exactly what comes from what, and you can see with certainty why this conclusion follows. Yeah.
So at 1 and 2, we have the axioms, but the inference rules, they are outside of the scheme.
Yeah. So they're sort of like, these are like, if you like, 1 and 2 are telling you, here's what the initial state of the game is, and the inference rules are the moves you can make. And then what 3, 4, 5 are recording are particular steps using the rules. Note we've got the rules listed that were used all the way until we hit the conclusion at the end. Yes?
Could you elaborate on the conjunction E1, E2?
Yeah, so all that's telling us is we're using conjunction elimination. Yeah, don't stress too much about this. But it's just saying, hey, sentence 1 is a conjunction. I know that if a conjunction's true, because of what conjunction means, then both conjuncts have to be true. The only way for the conjunction to be true is if both sides are true. So from A conjunction B, I can extract A must be true. That's what step 3 does. And also, B must be true. That's what step 4 does. And this E, conjunction E, is saying, hey, that's the rule that I use. I know from conjunction, conjunct. Again, to go back, we have these 2 kinds of rules. Introduction rules, which let us introduce a sentence with an operator, or elimination rules, which exploit some operator. Very nice. So the thing I really want to use with this is, again, don't stress too much about how this works or what this looks like. It's just to give you a sense of why you might be drawn towards this. Once you learn how to build these proofs, my God, it's so direct and clear. Now, there's a learning curve. You've got to get into it. But once it's there, once you know how to do this, you can see why it'd be attractive, right? Okay. And we can use it to do other things. Here's a way to prove the law of non-contradiction is true. We can even start from no assumptions whatsoever and generate a proof that it's not possible for a sentence and its negation to be true. Again, don't worry too much. Just an example. Or we can use it to show that some sentences are jointly inconsistent. That is, hey, if 1, 2, and 3 were all true, bad things happen. You get a contradiction. That's what the upside down T says. This is what Evans is doing in that little paper I showed you. He takes some assumptions and then shows you that at the end, if you believe these things, bad stuff. I'm not going to tell you what to do about it, but I'm going to show you that you shouldn't end up there. You got to give something up. So that was a neat little segue. Remember, where did we start? Why did we ask this question? Why were we talking about proof systems? because we wanted to know, how are we doing the deducing? Well, here's the answer. Let's use a formal proof system. They're beautiful, they're magic, they're so good. We can take some stuff as axioms, use the system's rules, derive a bunch of new cool results, and you will know how to get them. They will be secure. Problem. Problem. Which system do we use? Remember, with our opening question, I said, which language do we want to use? Which formal language are we symbolizing into? Here's the second question. What sort of inference rules am I allowed to employ? What moves am I allowed to make in each step of this game? The problem is that there are lots and lots of different ways to set a proof system up. You could have different axioms, different fundamental assumptions. More importantly, you could have different inference rules. And that's the problem. That's going to be a big problem. I'm going to talk about those for a little bit, and then we'll take a break. Sounds good? So here's where I want to kind of drive at this worry about the inference rules. And this is where Carol's little paper comes in. So, did everybody read the little story? Some. Okay. So it's a jokey follow-up to Zeno's paradox. Zeno's paradox is that Achilles is chasing the slow tortoise, and Zeno goes on to prove that there's no way for Achilles to catch the tortoise, because he would always have to get halfway, and then halfway, and then halfway. So there's an infinite number of steps before he can get to the tortoise. There's no way he'll ever catch it. That's why it starts with them saying, oh, so cool, you caught me, wonderful. But that's not really the point. The point is, what happens when somebody doesn't buy an inference rule? So the tortoise and Achilles are talking, and they're talking about Euclid. Geometry, basically. Doesn't really matter. But they have a sentence they call A, which says things that are equal to some third thing are equal to each other. Right? So if one side of a triangle is, a meter long, and the second side of a triangle is a meter long, and they're both as long as this meter stick, then the two sides are the same length. Makes sense, right? Sentence B, the length of two sides of this triangle are equal to the length of this meter stick. Conclusion. So, the two sides of this triangle are the same length. So what is this structure? It's basically something like that. I'm sorry for the crappy pen, but its first premise gives us a conditional. If A, then B. Second premise gives us the antecedent, A. Conclusion is B. And the tortoise says, cool. I totally accept premises A and B here, right? I accept the premises. Why does that mean that I have to accept the conclusion? Why do I have to accept the conclusion?
It's deductive, right?
Why is it deductive? What justifies or guarantees or enforces the rule that says I have to accept the conclusion given that I accept the premises? Well, maybe. But what we're asking here is what kind of guarantees that this is going to be valid?
Should value.
I like to get going. So here's what he's trying to push, right? Suppose you didn't already think that this was good reasoning. What could you say to somebody to convince them that this is good reasoning? What could you say to convince someone who is skeptical that this is good to believe that this is good? What would logically compel you to accept a conclusion if you bought the two premises? Well, Achilles says, oh, that's easy. Add a premise. You add a premise that says, hey, if the first two premises are true, then the conclusion follows. So it's basically equivalent to saying, like, hey, I'm taking this and I'm adding as a premise that. But the tortoise notes, cool. I like the new addition. Very neat. So I'm going to accept the three premises, but I still think I can just deny the conclusion. And Achilles starts to get mad. He says, look, if you accept A, B, and C, then you must accept the conclusion. But you can see the problem here, right? What is this? This is just another premise. This is just another premise. So that's just basically saying, okay, cool, this, and, I mean, we can do this all day, my dude. You're never getting me to B. Every time we seem to go a layer deeper, we just get another conditional premise. So what is it that's going to guarantee this is good reasoning? What's going to force someone who doesn't already accept modus ponens to believe in modus ponens? That's a problem. Why is it a problem? Remember where we started. We were asking the question, which deductive system should we use? Which proof system to use? That amounts to, which inference rules should we employ? What happens if we come across someone who's skeptical of an inference rule? Well, a lot of times you have to use the inference rule to justify the inference rule. We can't bootstrap them into it. That's bad.
That also makes it susceptible for immunity, because every time you say, like, oh, I don't believe the conclusion, you just add another premise to make it believable.
But it's not doing, in effect, what's happening is every time we add another premise, it's just moving the bubble in the carpet one layer back. It's never addressing the problem. That's the worry. So, it's a fun little story, and it is a really fun little story. It's very much worth reading if you haven't read it already. Right? It's short, too. But the reason why it's a problem for us is if we're thinking about which inference rules to include in our proof system, it looks like we already have to know which rules are good in order to know which system to use. So this cannot be a higher order methodology, because we've got to do a whole lot of philosophizing before we start doing our proving. We've got to know which inference rules are good before we build our proof system to then, well, we can't be doing that when which rules are good. So there's one problem. Here's our second problem. Now, this is something else I could say. We could encode modus ponens into the system. We could make it an inference rule, but no, that's just effectively begging the question. That's just saying, you have to buy this. Yeah, but I want to know why. I want a reason. You could kick it up. You could say, hey, the reason here isn't something in our object logic, our object proof system, but it's a rule in our meta logic, our meta proof system, our logic governing our logic. But that's not going to help, because we'll just run the same kind of argument at the metalogic level. So if there's any coherence to Tortoise's worry, which it seems like there is, this idea of using purely formal methods as a higher order approach to philosophy is in a lot of trouble. Okay. Before we go on, pause, ask, do we see the worry here? Does the worry make sense? Because if not, I want to make sure that we're all on board. Does the worry kind of make sense? Again, the dialectic is, right, oh, let's use these formal tools to just do philosophy. It is the only way, the big method to do philosophy. Problem, you got to do a whole lot of philosophizing before you can even start the method. You got to know which rules are good already. And that sounds a hell of a lot like philosophizing. Now the second problem, we'll talk about this and we'll take our break. Second problem has less to do with the inference rules and more to do with, in some sense, structuring the language. And we can put it this way. Which connectives ought to be in our logic? Which operators should we include? We know the 5 standard ones, right? Negation, conjunction, disjunction, the conditional, and the biconditional. But they're not always enough. Remember, talk about possibility and necessity. Looks like we might need some more. One natural thought is that perhaps we could just let our formal system decide. We specify the introduction and elimination rules, and that does the job. In fact, we might follow through in this idea and buy into what's called inferentialism. Inferentialism says a connective's meaning simply is the introduction and elimination rules that define it. So, what's a good connective? One that has very clear introduction and elimination rules. And then, which connective should our logic include? Well, it should include all the good connectives.
Counter-argument. Tonk.
Yes, that is our boy. That is our boy. So here's the problem with this kind of idea. Arthur Pryor's tonk. Tonk is a very stupid connective, but it's magic. Tonk says, hey, if you start off with any sentence P, you can tonk it to get P, tonk, Q, for any sentence Q. So from P, you can get P, tonk, Q, by an application of tonk introduction. And, importantly, it also says, hey, if you have a sentence with tonk as its main operator, you can tonk eliminate and get out Q. Why is this a problem? Because we can now derive anything. Take any axiom you want as P. Tonk to P tonk Q for any Q. Tonk to Q, whatever Q is. So why is this interesting for us? So it's interesting because this raises a huge problem for inferentialism, which is interesting in its own way. But why is this important for us? Tonk is bad. Tonk is a bad operator. It's a bad connective. But we have to know that it's a bad connective in order to know that any logic that features it is bad. The logic itself doesn't settle the matter. It's the same problem we had just a minute ago with the inferential rules. You already have to have done a lot of philosophizing to know that this isn't acceptable. So this means that as a general, very broad method, this stuff isn't going to cut the mustard. You've got to do a lot of philosophy before this stuff can really get its teeth in. Okay. So what we've done is raised 2 significant problems with that second step and a problem for the first step. Remember, the first step was symbolizing. The problem here was pick which language. That matters. The second step was deduce. And we had two problems here, basically stemming down to the same issue. You need to tell me what kind of deduction rules I'm allowed to use before I can even do my proof system. But telling me which deductive rules I'm allowed to use already sounds like philosophy. And I thought what I'm doing here is supposed to be the philosophizing. It sounds like we've got to do the philosophy first, then get the machinery that we can do the philosophizing with. Either we're in a terrifying loop, or this can't be the beginning. So far, so good?
Doesn't it then become like a process of trial and error that you just, I don't know, you just need to like experiment and see like which rules work and which don't?
Yeah, good. So note but in order to evaluate whether the rules are good or bad, or work or don't work,
True.
you got to know what you're looking for, right? You've got to have your target notions already to then see, yeah, I'm getting closer and closer and closer and closer. Otherwise, Tonk's good, baby. It's got clear rules. What's wrong with that?
And you just made Tonk up?
Yeah, it's just it's a kind of silly.
Yeah.
Right. But it works really nicely to prove the point we're after here. So let me stress, right? This isn't to say that these tools are bad. This is just to say, if we're thinking of this as the method for doing philosophy, we got some issues. That's all we're trying to drive at here. So, we're at 46. I'm like, please, yes.
I don't really understand how you can just add something to the language, and if it doesn't work, I mean there should be a method to prove that Tonk is stupid, right? You can't just add something and then make the whole language invalid.
But importantly, what we'd be doing in order to think about why Tonk is stupid, right, is we couldn't use the language that features Tonk. We'd have to be doing some kind of reasoning about the formal system we're trying to construct. It's like, oh, we really screwed up there. And that reasoning sounds a whole lot like philosophizing. And if that's the case, then this isn't a good answer to the big kind of how do we do philosophy question. It tells us a way to do lower order philosophy, how to make some progress on something we've already got a grip on and we've had some place to start. But this cannot be the answer if we're starting from nothing, if we're doing philosophizing without already having done something. That's really what I'm after here. And your worry is exactly that, just re-expressed the other way. Of course we can make the machinery work better. That's because we already have an idea of what we want it to do. And if we have to have that, then this machinery is super cool, very powerful, very useful, but it's not the thing you do first. That's the point. It's a good word. I hope you can kind of see what I'm after here, right? Okay, cool. So, 48, we take 10 minutes. No? Just want to keep going? People want to keep going? Is that okay? Beautiful. I love it. I love it. So again, what have we done? Harold's tortoise and Pryor's Tonk both push us towards the same broad point. By itself, a proof system isn't going to tell us how to make good inferences. By itself. That's the important thing here, right? It's that clause. By itself. That's because we already have to have, exactly as we were just talking about, we have to have a concept of what it is that we're looking for, at least in some way, shape, or form, in order for this machinery to even get going. Otherwise, Tonk is perfectly fine. We've got to have some grip on what inferences are good or acceptable or the ones that we want or desirable. That sounds a little bit like we've got to do some philosophizing before we get the machinery going.
So you need to maybe go from higher order philosophy to lower order.
Again, when we're thinking about this sort of higher order methodology versus lower order methodology. So what I mean here is that we have to have some grip on already what looks like good philosophical methods to answer some kind of answer to the higher order question before we can start using this machinery, which seems to be very good for answering lower order questions. And again, I don't like the higher and lower suggest like one's more important than the other, and that's not really the case. It's just scrambling around to find some way to differentiate the how do I do philosophy in the sense of what tools do I have in my toolkit to answer a philosophical question versus something like what even is a philosophical question? Which ones count as philosophical and which ones don't? This is not going to answer that for you. And if that's what you wanted, this is not the right place. Super good for answering. Once you've got a question, how do you answer it? Cool, my baby, this is beautiful. But is it going to help you with the big one? Less clear. Looks like you got to have something there already. Might help you formulate it better. Might help you understand what would follow from certain answers to the big one. But it doesn't look like it's going to help you answer that big overarching question because of these issues. So let me stress something. This hopefully also, if you're worried, why did we spend so much time last year learning formal logic? Again, this doesn't mean what we've been talking about, doesn't mean these systems are useless or bad. Just be clear about what it's for. It is not going to be that higher order method. It is a lower order tool. It's a very good tool. But it certainly doesn't look like the kind of thing that helps you answer that big question of what counts as a philosophical question. That's fine. That's totally fine. Okay. So remember, 3 steps. Step 1 was symbolize, and we had the question about which language to symbolize into. Step 2 was deduce, and we had this question about which rules, which symbols are we allowed. Step 3 was profit. And here's the last kicker. That's kind of funny about deductive methods. Deductive logic is epistemically impeccable. Unfortunately, it's epistemically impeccable because it's what we call non-amplitive. Non-amplitive is a kind of evasive notion. It's something that ancient logicians came up with. But really broadly, you can put it this way. Amplitive reasoning gives you new information. I've dropped the pen 99,000 times, whatever the hell the pen is. I've dropped the pen 99 times. Therefore, the next time I drop the pen, it falls to the ground. That future prediction, that's new information. When we think about deductive arguments, there's a sense in which we're not getting new information. And that's because the conclusion of a valid deductive argument, a good deductive argument, is in a sense already in the premises. Yeah.
The cognitive value you gain out of it is the generalization.
Something like this, or you might, there's this way, this talk about like new information, it's a bit slippery, because it also could be, framing or presenting something in a new way. There's plenty of ways that you might learn something.
Yeah.
Right? But again, there's a sense in which there's nothing new, right? It was there in the premises the whole time, you just didn't see it yet. So goes the thought. But that's the big trick. And in fact, this is the trade-off. Right? Deductive arguments are epistemically perfect, impeccable, wonderful, because they're not amplative. And the problem with inductive and abductive arguments is that, by definition, they are amplative, give you something new, and it might be that the old stuff and the new thing are detachable. That's why we don't have many valid abductive and inductive arguments.
Maybe it's very, speaking for self-question, but this kind of leads me to think that we just need induction, deduction, abduction all the same all the time together.
They are all different tools that we can use. And in fact, the method we're going to talk about next basically says, yeah, use any of these tools you want in the different times. Again, that's fine, right? Use the machinery in the places it's appropriate to. Don't use a lathe if what you're trying to do is cut a board. Use the saw. Yes?
Does this mean that, for instance, ChatGPT is just rechewing, or is also non-ampliative because it's just a computer program?
So it's difficult here. There's a sense in which it's ampliative in that it generates potentially new strings. So let's set aside whether it's saying anything, right? Just think about it in terms of generating strings of English words. Grammatically correct, hopefully, but not necessarily, right? It's an ampliative tool if what it can do is generate new strings that have never existed before. And that's irrelevant, or that's true regardless of whether it's saying things or not. So yeah, that's fine. So that could be in some sense an ampliative tool, but that's not really the kind of thing we're after here, right? Here what we're thinking of is, in some sense, inferential tools. Statistical reasoning is going to be, in some sense, ampliative. Inductive reasoning is ampliative. Abductive reasoning is ampliative. Deductive reasoning, not so much. Okay. So, again, what we've done, we've raised challenges for all three of the steps. This view offers a very attractive, I think, simple methodology. Symbolize, deduce, profit. But there are reasons to be worried about all three of the steps. Which language do we symbolize into? Which rules are we allowed to use? And how much new stuff will we actually get here? This makes it clear, I hope, that while these deductive tools are incredibly useful, they aren't a panacea for our methodological ideas or our worries. They're not going to help us answer that. What's a philosophy question? What demarcates philosophy from these other subjects? But that's okay. It's just not what they're there for. The big issue with these, and I hope it was clear, the big issue and the reason why it's not going to help us answer those questions is, in all of these cases, there's a sense in which we already have to have a base for these tools to work on. We need to have done a bunch of philosophizing in order for the tools to get going. Okay. So, that was kind of negative in its way, but I hope it was very clear that there's a lot of, obviously, I think, there's an immense amount of value in these logical tools, and these formal tools. I just want it to be very clear that if you think that they might be the solution to the big methodology worries, no, that can't be right. Let's talk about a different answer. Let's talk about a different method. And this different method is, being really blunt, again, the way that a lot of analytic philosophers implicitly work. So that's why it's useful to see this method in action. And I've flailed around a little bit for coming up with a name. We can call it something like counting costs or employing theory choice methods. We'll try and cash it out. So, remember, our overarching worry since basically the beginning of lecture 2 has been, how do we make philosophical progress? Doesn't seem like we have. When can we settle a philosophical debate? We also talked about when can we know that a philosophical claim is true or false? Or we might put it another way, when do we have a knockdown argument for or against a philosophical claim? When do we know that it's true or know that it's false? And similarly, what I hope has become kind of clear, especially at least from the previous section, is that when we're doing philosophy, it seems pretty obvious that we can't just start from nowhere. Philosophy doesn't just bootstrap itself into existence. Maybe some of it does, some of it's analytic, but a lot of it isn't. Even to the point of like what we deduce from the analytic stuff, right? I'm just talking about that, right? The inference rules that we're happy to employ. So you might ask, where do we start? Now, let's take the second of these first. Where do we start? And in fact, the methodology I want to talk to you about right now, that's where it starts from this question. What do we start with? It's a really flat-footed answer, but we start with our ordinary pre-philosophical opinions. They're just as good as anything else, so screw it. Let's start with them. Go with what you know, or at least go with what you think you know before you start doing philosophy. Call it common sense. Call it your pre-theoretical or pre-philosophical opinions. But cool, let's start with those. So if we're going to have axioms, let's take these as the axioms. They're just as good as any other thing. And we can bolster them if you want as we go about and we learn new things empirically or we make some armchair reasoning. We can plug those in. But that'll be a good place to start. Let's start with our common sense, these pre-philosophical opinions. Note, opinions. They don't have to be secure. They don't have to be guaranteed to be known. They can be gut feelings, whatever.
In normal language, or are we using like a formal language?
Good. So importantly, which language we want to express, that could also be something that's going to go in here. We might say, hey, you know what? I express this kind of claim in English, but really when I think about it, my English is misleading me. I think it's probably better like this. Sounds really hideous in English. Looks better in my TFL or FOL. That's in there too. Now the worry, of course, is that's already starting to sound a little philosophical. But again, roughly, let's take what we got. Easy one. How do we respond to the skeptic, the global skeptic? Oh, you know, this all might be a dream, or we might be in the Matrix. The response that this kind of thing is suggesting is, is everyone familiar with the Morean response to the skeptic? So G.E. Moore famously responds to global skepticism. He says, here's a hand, let's get to work because there's a world. Basically, the belief that we have hands, a little bit ableist, but we'll go with it. Right? The belief that we have hands is on better epistemic footing than any kind of skeptical argument to the contrary. Anyone who tries to undercut that commonsensical belief has already reductioed themselves. There's something like that here. Let's start with the belief that there's a material world and we're all in it, and that you all have minds, and that I'm talking in a language that's meaningful. That seems, sorry?
It's already within the project of the logical positivists, right?
Some
So
ways.
trying to consolidate the belief that there is a reality and research is possible.
Yes. So what we're doing is we're going to start with these. Now we might abandon them, but we're going to start with this stuff. Because pretty good place. Pretty good place. These pre-philosophical opinions give us a good starting point, a launch pad. But they're not immune to revision. It's not like we have to always hold on to them. If a philosophical argument comes along that conclusively shows that one of our pre-philosophical opinions is bad, cool. So much the worse for the opinion. On the same side, if it suggests or makes it a little bit ugly to keep my opinion, well, doesn't mean I have to let it go. So again, the thought here is that there's something like what we'll call Morean truths, named after G.E. Moore. There are some claims that are more certain than the premises of any argument to the contrary. Again, the easiest one, the belief that we have hands is more certain to us than the premises of any skeptical argument. The argument already reductios itself if it tries to undercut this claim. That's the really strong version. Now, there are weaker versions, right? Something might not be necessarily immune to revision. But I'm going to be pretty skeptical of any argument's premises that go against this thing that I really like. Not guaranteed that it's wrong, but my gut says this is bad because this is good. So the idea here isn't that, right, the folk, to read Lewis, right, the folk know in their blood what the highfalutin philosophers may forget. And it's not that common sense speaks with some infallible faculty of intuition. It's just that this view is the only sensible policy for theorists of limited powers who are duly modest about what they could accomplish after a fresh start. Part of this view is a reluctance to accept theories that fly in the face of common sense. But it's a matter of balance and judgment. Okay. So where do we start? We start with our pre-philosophical opinions. What do we do once we start coming across philosophical arguments or challenges to these pre-philosophical opinions? Well, we play a game of balance and judgment. How do we make progress in philosophy? We have a range of philosophical theories concerning some topic. Which one do we pick? The problem, the reason we've been so worried about methodology, was we were always looking for knockdown arguments. That was the mistake. We shouldn't be looking for knockdown arguments. We should be weighing up the costs and benefits of a given theory, and then settling on the one that pays off the best given the costs that it incurs.
Pays off as in how?
Good. So we're going to talk about that next. So this methodology says, right, let's look at the costs and benefits of a theory, and you find the one that gives you the best profit. Follow-up question, cool. What are costs? What are benefits? And how do we do the weighing? Got to say some things about those. So let's talk about those in turn. But do we see the basic idea? Right? There's a reason this is very natural, because I think this is what we do a lot of times when we make general decisions. Here's Lewis and Lewis on Holes. I don't know if any of you guys have seen this movie. It's really good, actually. It's a kid's movie, but it's really fun. Okay, so Lewis and Lewis on Holes. They talk about, I forget if it's Argyle or Bargyle. I think it's Argyle's commitment to materialism, and how Argyle's commitment to materialism seems to lead them to not be able to say that holes exist. Because if they say holes exist, then they become an ontological cheater, if you remember from last year. So what this means is that Argyle's theory has to pay a price. And its price is implausibility. Pre-philosophically, holes exist, absolutely. Argyle's theory is costly because it tells us, that's not quite true. Or, it is true, but not in the way that you thought it meant. The cost here is either disagreement with pre-philosophical opinion or really warping pre-philosophical opinion. And you can see a connection here with that ordinary language philosophy stuff, right? Remember, they said you take a common sense notion and you stretch it and break it. Well, in some sense, that's leaning into the implausibility. But a theory earns credence. It gives you a benefit through clarity and theoretical economy. What the hell do those mean? We're going to talk about in a second. But this gives us an idea of what we look for as costs and benefits. So a theory can gain benefits by agreeing or confirming or supporting pre-philosophical opinions, by being clear. And what we mean here isn't a matter of style, right? It's written in a very easy to read way, but rather it offers conceptual clarity. It doesn't blur notions together. It gives you very clear application conditions, things like this. So a bad example, a case of not much clarity, is my distinction between higher and lower order versions of the methodology question. I'm after something, but I don't have a good way to characterize it yet. So that's a mark against the clarity of my philosophical story there.
But isn't that very ambiguous?
It is.
So where does it start and where does it end then?
Good. That's more grist to the mill, right? Because how you settle that is just more either philosophy or pre-philosophical opinion. That's part of the method. Similarly, another value that you can get is economy, theoretical economy, by having fewer primitive theoretical postulates, fewer basic notions. Systematicity, you have a unified explanation for various things. And the last one comes up a little bit less in philosophy, but it's also there. Empirical adequacy fits with empirical evidence. Yeah.
What do you mean with primitive theoretical postulates?
Good. So the idea here is that, right, every theory is going to have to start with some kind of basic units or notions or concepts.
Protocol sentences.
Yeah, something like this. Or even just take like in physics, right? We could reduce everything down to force, right? Force and energy. Those are our only fundamental posits for a long time until it turns out that, okay, this doesn't cover, it's not empirically adequate. So we need to start postulating more. Now we could postulate distinct special magnetic forces in lots of different cases, but we try and narrow it down and say, oh, it's just these 5 or these 3. That's the kind of reduction of primitive notions, the fundamental things that you think are there. It's worth noting, these, I put it in terms of a theory. This could be a philosophical theory, this could be a scientific theory, this could be any kind of theory you like. So these are ways to gain benefits. Costs. You gain cost, unsurprisingly. The big cost is disagreeing with our pre-philosophical opinions. By being unclear. By having a bloated theoretical economy, postulating lots of fundamental things. Being idiosyncratic or unsystematic. And not fitting with empirical evidence, or being non-empirically adequate. Now, let me stress, these 2 lists of benefits and costs are not exhaustive. There could be lots of other ways to incur costs. And everything I've said has been vague. But that is a feature, not a bug. Because what we're gesturing at here is broad concepts that you can fill in using your pre-philosophical opinions. In some way, shape, or form. Would it be better to have absolutely clear definitions? Absolutely, because lack of clarity is a cost. But it might be such that if we clear them out or explicate them fully, we're not going to agree with all of the relevant pre-philosophical ways we want to structure this. So we've made a decision. The fit with pre-philosophical opinion is better, or it trumps the fuzziness. It justifies it. It's a cost I decided was worth paying. So, how do we do the weighing? Well, That's just more stuff that's going to go into this deciding. Put another way, remember the question we had about the formal method. Which inference rules do we like? Well, remember how we said we already had to buy certain inference rules to then put them into our formal system? Same thing here. Which costs and benefits are you going to find extremely costly or extremely beneficial? I don't know, dude, that's on you. It'd be helpful if you can spell it out. Tell us. Very useful for communicating. And we might disagree. But we can explicate the reasons as to why we have in support of this weighting versus that weighting. And then there might be some meta stuff that allows for us to then synthesize those two together. But that's just going to be more grist to this mill. Once the menu of well-worked-out theories is before us, philosophy on this view is a matter of opinion. Our pre-theoretical opinions impact what costs we'll find acceptable or unacceptable, which benefits we think are not worth paying for or worth paying for, and even which ones we take to be deal breakers or not. What Morean truths you want to accept as immutable, that's going to give you a different philosophizing theory. Note, the key word there, theory. Doesn't mean that the world is different for you. Just means that your picture of the world is going to be a certain kind of way.
That depends on what you see as primary, right? Because if you're an idealist, you could state that the theory makes you see the world different, makes the world different.
Yeah.
But if you're
But I think yeah, that's what that top thing. So yeah, cool. I'm pretty sure most people are going to find idealism not very happy. It's not going to be a kind of view that they're willing to pay the coin for. But that's okay, right? Again, we can articulate it. We can explain why these are the costs I'm not willing to take. These are the kind of costs that the view incurs and what it's going to, if you like it, pay. Cool, that's fine. As long as everybody's clear on what we're paying, that's the method. Yeah. It's not necessarily settling which view to take. It's just telling you, how do you decide what the options are? What's the menu look like and what does each entree cost? This methodology mirrors theory choice in science. It does also mean that conclusive refutations of philosophical views are going to be very few and far between. Instead, we weigh theories up against each other, comparing and contrasting their good and bad qualities, seeing what costs we want to pay, what costs we don't find acceptable. And ultimately, which theory we adopt is going to be a matter of opinion. It's going to be an upshot of the mishmash of pre-theoretical things that we bought and whatever philosophical theories we've already accepted along the way. So a couple questions with this view and some problems. This is I find it a very intuitive and attractive view because it sits perfectly and naturally with theory choice in science. But one question or objection we might raise is how strongly should we hold our pre-philosophical opinions? When we're confronted with philosophical arguments that they're false, which one goes? And if you really entrench, if you take your pre-philosophical opinions as Morean, in that really strong sense of Morean, they're immutable, you've effectively decided to embrace something like theoretical dogmatism. Common sense beliefs, according to this, are going to be immune from revision. That's problematic. Because, well, I mean, why are you even bothering with the philosophizing then? A weaker option is to go into a kind of theoretical conservatism. This is where you hold your starting beliefs, but you still can give them up. You just need good reasons. But of course, what counts as good reasons, that's going to depend on the rest of the stuff you buy. Okay. So there's one problem. A second problem with this method is that there may never be convergence. In a really, really strong way. Not just that, oh, we may never figure out the philosophical truths, but it's very possible that we end up in some pretty heavy-duty philosophical sectarianism, where, given all of the kind of pre-theoretical opinions I have and how the cost and benefit, my view, paid off, and the pre-theoretical commitments you had and how the cost and benefits have paid off for you, we literally have nothing to share philosophically with each other, or basically nothing. If two rational people start from rationally different places, and they behave perfectly rationally, there's no guarantee that they're ever going to converge. They might diverge. And then the next round of people who come along might diverge further and further and further. And that could be a problem, because what you could very easily end up with then is massive splintered camps of philosophers who can't really talk to each other. That's a bad option, bad result, but the method doesn't block that.
I mean, like, if you look at society, if you look at all the different disciplines there are, for example, somebody that works as a coder and somebody that works in the kitchen, those aren't related to each other, but they are like, derived from some.
Yeah, but the thing here is that you might think the difference is that they're talking about different subjects.
Yeah.
Here, everyone would be talking about the same subject.
Oh, yeah.
It'd be like two cooks who can't talk to each other about how to cook.
Ethics, kind of, right?
Well, so it's stronger than that, right? So remember, we started off we're talking about the big subject. And if we follow this method, we'd be following the method, we'd both be following the method, but we'd end up in so radically different places that we'd have next to nothing in common. That's a problem. Sorry, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because you stated it's a bad thing if we diverge, but maybe it's a sidestep from this class, but that would only be valid if one holds the unification of mankind. Yes.
So again, I think that's a bad option because I think that, that radical divergence is basically that top point, right? I have a pre-theoretical opinion that we're getting closer and closer to the truth. And so, it's bad if we don't ever do that. Let me give you the bad one. So let me give you the big worry. The big worry. Remember, on this view, once we have all the menu options, it becomes a matter of opinion. What the fuck? I thought the whole point was to try and avoid philosophy just becoming, that's your opinion, man. So does it make philosophy just opinion mongering after all? No. No. It makes philosophical theorizing opinion. But it doesn't mean that there's no truth to be had. It doesn't mean that we end up with just like, oh man, that's just your world and this is my world. It's that when we're constructing our philosophical theories of the world, they're driven by opinion. That's fine. That's fine. Theories are one thing. The things theories are about. The world is another thing. So goes this view. That's why we, replace the dude's face with Lewis's face. Maybe neither of us is making any mistake of method. We may be bringing our opinions to equilibrium in the most careful possible way, taking account of all the arguments, distinctions, counterexamples. We disagree. But one of us, at least, is making a mistake of fact. Which one is wrong depends on what there is, how the world is. It isn't a problem on our end. We did the best we could with what we had. But hey, just ends up that one of us turns out to be wrong. Which one? Who knows? We're doing our best. Remember, this is all driven by a kind of epistemic humility. We're doing the best we can from where we're started with the tools we have available to us. So, this method, this the sort of cost-benefit analysis method, the equilibrium method, it has a beautiful upshot of putting philosophy or putting methodology of philosophy in line with theory choice and science. It gives us an answer to the higher order question. How do you answer philosophical questions? Well, you kind of take your theoretical opinions and, weigh up the costs and benefits and see which one you like best, what answer you like best. The negative is that it doesn't really conclusively answer any of these things. Instead, it kind of gives you like, well, I like this one for these reasons, and she likes this one for these reasons, and whose reasons are better, I don't know. But that's okay. Maybe that's the best we can do.
What part plays logic in this? So
Good. So there's still lots of room to figure out what follows from the various commitments that we have. Whether something, in fact, doesn't fit with our opinions, things like this. There's plenty of room for those tools to still come into play. Right? Lots of stuff there. So, okay. Let me wrap up. Sorry, going way too long. Almost finished. Our last bit. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? So the past few weeks, we've been talking about this sort of higher order method question. How do we do philosophy? What's philosophy as a subject? What counts as a philosophical question? We've been thinking about these very broad scope methods. That's what we talked about the last week with those two options. That's what we've talked about this week with the two options. It's been mostly negative, to be honest. That's fine. Philosophy is quite negative. But what we're going to do now is, again, tone shift. The next 3 weeks, so the remainder of this sort of block, we're going to talk about, I call them lower order methods. That is, we're going to talk about specific tools that we can use to address particular philosophical questions and answers. So what tools can we use as philosophers, analytic philosophers in this half anyway, to answer philosophical questions? And specifically, what we're going to talk about next week is how to use digital and computational methods. Importantly, Gregor, who's going to come and give the guest lecture, is going to focus mostly on history of philosophy. And he's going to talk about how we can use these special computational tools to do history of philosophy. But also how we can use this to do capital P analytic philosophy. What kind of things can these tools actually let us do? Is it just playing around with graphs, or does it actually give us something new and exciting? So there's a couple papers up. I put them, I think, on the... Yes, I uploaded the links earlier. They should be there. Yeah, thanks for coming, guys. Have a lovely rest of the week. And yeah, we'll see you next Thursday.